Welcome to Coffee with Kish. Okay, so today I'm going to talk a little bit about how I moved out of LDS Apologetics. So I've told you the story about how I discovered Hugh Nibley when I was a high school student, read Since Cumorah, was really fascinated by it. I think before then, I had read quite a bit of Bruce R. McConkie's Mormon Doctrine, and even though some of the stuff in that book really troubled me, I was still really interested in certain doctrinal ideas like Mormon theology surrounding intelligence, etc. But with Hugh Nibley, I really started to take a deep dive into intellectual matters in LDS faith. On my mission, I continued to read Hugh Nibley's stuff, even though it was a little bit, it was against the rules, but I would take money that I had, sort of save it up by eating crappy food, and buy Hugh Nibley books at the LDS bookstore next to the mission office in my mission. And, you know, I really on my mission, and I think it's partly thanks to Hugh Nibley, I really started to read more widely and think more carefully about what I was reading in the scriptures, particularly in the New Testament, the Gospel of John, the Epistles of John, etc., etc. And I also, of course, as a missionary, got into Bible bashing or mixing it up with the owners of Christian bookstores, Christian ministers in their morning Bible studies with teenagers. I would meet people head on, and I was willing to argue with them. And you know, for a dumb kid who didn't really know much, admittedly, I did a passable job even against Christian ministers, trained Christian ministers. So, I mean, there were certain holes in my knowledge. For example, at the time I was on a mission, I hadn't studied New Testament Greek. Of course, I prepared that when I went to college and started studying ancient studies, and I studied Greek and Latin and Coptic. But as a missionary, you know, I was basically just using my knowledge of the King James New Testament to you know, lock horns with these Christian ministers. When I got home from my mission, you know, I think I'd started to mature a little bit as someone who was willing to debate with Christian ministers and missionaries. I'd really come to the conclusion that getting ugly and arguing vehemently in a way that was designed to be feisty and oppositional wasn't really the best idea. And so I think my goal became, as a budding Mormon apologist, just to come to a place where I had convinced my opponents that, you know, really there was room for my interpretation. They might be able to understand where I was coming from, even though they didn't agree with it. And we could leave the conversation on, you know, somewhat amicable terms. And honestly, after having some unpleasant arguments, I was really happy to come to that position where we could leave our debate on amicable terms. And I think that really says a lot about where I landed before I even got to BYU. So I'm at BYU. We've talked a little bit about how I got to BYU. It was partly through the help of my mission president, who wrote me a very generous letter of recommendation. Because my mission president, for whatever reason, liked me, thought I had a good sense of humor, and thought I was, of course, sufficiently committed to the gospel et cetera, and smart, I guess smart enough that he was willing to recommend me to BYU, and I got accepted. I went, started studying ancient studies, was still very interested in apologetics because I was still very much a Nibley guy. So what happened in the midst of it? I mean, here I am. I've landed in the place. I'm where I really wanted to be, where I felt like personal revelation had led me to the land of Nibley, to taking classes with Nibley, etc., etc. So what could possibly have gone wrong here? Well, there were a few things. And a couple of them happened to BYU. The first one, and I think both of them really happened, honestly, when I started my MA program. And a lot of things were changing in my master's program. I got a master's degree in comparative literature, and even though in ancient studies I had started to really carefully think about texts in earnest, if you learn dead languages, if you're studying dead languages, you're getting really heavy into grammar. It's not like the basic language arts training that you get in modern languages or English courses today. You're really getting down into the mechanics of interpreting sentences on a syntactical level, even down in some cases to linguistics, and it's pretty intense. But comparative literature opened up my mind to reading texts through different lenses. There's not a single right meaning of a text necessarily, and there are always going to be struggles in the interpretive process. There are always lots of choices to be made. And it's when I started to really find in myself the freedom to interpret texts in different ways that I started reevaluating my religion in some ways. Like, I remember one time going through a session in the Provo Temple and asking myself, well, what if I were a woman? What would the experience of going through the endowment be like? So I did it, and I thought, oh, well, this is really quite a bit different from what it's like to go through as a guy. And of course, I hadn't really only the faintest inkling at the time of what it really was like for a woman to go through it, but I was at least trying, right? Well, as I go through this process of learning how to read text in different ways, I'm also still heavily involved in reading Mormon apologetics. I'm reading any interesting book that catches my eye in the BYU bookstore, and the BYU bookstore actually had a pretty broad selection. It wasn't just all the things Deseret Book deems to publish, but a wide array of books that are published on the topic of Mormonism were available in the BYU bookstore. And so I'm pretty sure I got my copy of Strangers in Paradox by the Toscanos, which had a huge impact on me, by the way. To this day, it remains one of my favorite books about Mormonism and about Mormon theology. And of course, it would be considered highly heterodox, but I think it's highly heterodox in all of the right ways. Anyway, and I read the Farm's Review of Books. And that was the problem for me. I'm sure there's some people who really loved the Farm's Review of Books. I'm not going to say that the Farm's Review of Books was without value, but to me, reading the Farm's Review of Books became kind of a problem. So I had read this book by John L. Brooke, Refiner's Fire, about Mormon cosmology, which was really, in the end, about the connection of Western esotericism. So esoteric, magical, more occultish ideas coming out of the Renaissance, how these kinds of ideas, how this stream of thought might have influenced Mormonism. And I read this, and it immediately struck me as intuitively correct. Even though I knew that this author really hadn't been able to connect the dots adequately, I thought, I think this is right. I had been thinking along these lines for a little while. I had certain intuitions, particularly about the importance of classical thought for Mormonism, even classical meaning Greek and Roman religious thought for Mormonism. Whereas most people who do the sort of Farms, Nibley stuff, etc., are really interested in ancient Near Eastern studies. I was really interested in the Greco-Roman stuff, but I really intuited that there was something about this that was really inherently, uniquely important to know to understand Mormonism, and I really thought that this is what John L. Brooke was saying. So I read some Farms Review of Books reviews of John L. Brooke's work, and the one that sticks in my mind, I don't know if at this point in time whether there was more than one. There may have been more than one review. Sometimes these guys at Farms Review of Books, they're just piling on the reviews, especially if they don't like a book like Quinn's Early Mormonism, Magic Worldview. They might have a bevy of reviews because everyone's champing at the bit to knock down this work of scholarship. And I think it's very telling that, at least from my perspective, on a number of occasions when this was done, I really think that the Farms Review people were really in the wrong. Intellectually, I think in the wrong. Well, they were very intellectually conservative with a particular theological bent, which may have been right for their purposes, but in the long run, I think didn't move the ball forward intellectually. Well, John L. Brooke, in my opinion, for all the faults his book had, moved the ball forward. And yet he was really roughed up by the LDS scholarly community, particularly the apologists, to the point where he felt that he had been abused. And I think he backed away from doing scholarship on Mormonism altogether because it was just so, frankly, unpleasant. And so I read Dr. Daniel C. Peterson's review of early Mormonism, or not early Mormonism, but on John L. Brooke's Refiner's Fire. And I couldn't believe what I was reading, honestly. And again, I'm not saying this because I have it in for Dr. Peterson, or I think he's a bad guy, or he has no good motives or commitments or motivations behind what he does. But on an intellectual level, as a historian, and as someone who is striving to learn how to become a professional academic, I was aghast at what I was reading in his review. And that was one of the first times that I really thought, there's something wrong with LDS apologetics. I'm not on board with this. It's one thing to attack an anti-Mormon who's really trying to destroy the LDS Church, but that wasn't John L. Brooke. He'd done a serious work of historical scholarship. It wasn't perfect, but it moved the ball forward. And instead of treating him, I think, with professionalism, politeness, certain things that are really, in my mind, not exactly the goal of the Farms Review of Books, unfortunately. And I don't mean that to be mean. I just think that the Farms Review of Books has other priorities, and those priorities are protecting LDS people, protecting their testimonies. There's not room for saying, hey, this book might not be something that faithful LDS people would be strengthened by in their testimonies. Nevertheless, it's an important work of scholarship, whatever its other faults may be. That's not what their goal was. I didn't really completely understand that, and I was really upset by this review. So at the time, I was reading Virgil's Aeneid in Latin with Stephen Ricks, and I asked him a question about this. I said, well, I don't understand this review that this BYU professor, has written about John L. Brooks' book. Can you help me understand it? And he goes, well, I'm good friends with Dr. Peterson. We were missionary companions, so I'll ask him if you want. Why were you so dismissive of this book? And I'd kind of forgotten about it. I thought, well, sure, maybe he'll ask, maybe he won't. But sure enough, a few weeks later, he and I had gotten together for our weekly Aeneid reading, and at the end, I was about to go, and Stephen Ricks said to me, oh, by the way, I talked to Dr. Peterson, and I asked him your question about his review. And I said, oh, really? I was surprised. Okay. That was really nice and very, can't believe that he would remember this as he did. But Stephen Ricks is that kind of guy. He's a great guy. And I said, so what did Dr. Peterson say? And Stephen Ricks said, well, he said that bad or stupid books, I think it was actually stupid books, deserve to be ridiculed. And I was just, what? I couldn't believe it, man. Those are just too much. But, and again, I'm not trying to lay this at the feet, particularly of Dr. Peterson, but I think it was representative of the disjuncture between my mindset as a budding scholar and the goals that the Farms Review books had, that I was just like, okay, that's just completely not what I'm about. And it helped me make up my mind that even though as much of a Nibley person as I was, I didn't want to go down that road. So anyway, I'll continue the story later, but for now, I've promised you shorter episodes, and that's what I'm going to give. So please like and subscribe if you like these videos. If you like my insights as a person who entered academics, who was into LDS Apologetics, who went to BYU, who had some relationship with the world of LDS Apologetics, and then became a critic for a long time. If you like what I have to say, please subscribe, please like, please watch my other videos, and have a great day. Coffee with Kish. Geeking out about Mormonism. Take care.